Good afternoon. I am your host, facilitator, Dr. Derek A. Reeves. I want to begin our series on social evolution. Social evolution is a very interesting teaching, and it is a teaching, in my opinion, that has caused much disintegration of society and of the hearts and the minds of men. It is a system that originates from the belief system almost as if it is akin to pantheism, because the evolutionary thought considers or begins to uphold the probability that God is not the creator of the universe and that the universe evolves from crystals and dust, and somehow, because of the spiraling of this dust, it begins to produce what we call the ontological physical reality. In some senses, the construction or the construct of the universe was just merely the universe coming into existence, in that it is considered to be an eternal existence. And so from the very beginning, evolution then supposes that nature itself is the end of all things. It is the beginning and the end of all things. And therefore, from an evolutionary perspective, mankind is just one of the organisms that has arisen from the smaller portions of life to become something greater. And in this sense, then, to denote that man rises from just a natural random process, it also denotes that any type of supreme absolute law does not exist. And this supreme absolute law and purposes that were designated by God, if God is not in existence, then there are no divine purposes for man. Man does not have a divine objective. And then to initiate it as the solidification of what is real, what is truth, man then becomes another creature that is simply struggling to survive. And this mentality has fostered the concept that only the strong shall survive. And so as we begin to deal with social evolution, we must start first with the evolutionary decorum. The evolutionary decorum and protocols suggest that all creatures simply came from a smaller single-celled animal, and over millions, perhaps billions of years, then through the adaptation of the strong, these individual organisms begin to change over a period of time. And because of the law of randomity and the law of adaptation, the change produced larger organisms from the smaller and the more simpler organisms. There are two types of categories of evolution. The first type is called microevolution. And microevolution is the evolutionary change within a species or a small group of organisms, especially over a short period of time. Microevolution is moving from something that is extremely small, in very small increments over a small period of time, to bring subtle changes, not necessarily the changes in the nature or the entire taxonomy of an organism, but simply changing perhaps the appearance. One such example of microevolution is that if there are chemicals that are released into a pond of frogs, then the frogs can begin to alter in their color. Maybe some of their webbing becomes thicker, or maybe the spots on their backs become thicker or more pronounced. And so these microevolutionary changes are subtle changes that do not change the species in its entirety. And then there is macroevolution. Macroevolution is the major evolutionary change that occurs over a long period of time. The term applies mainly to the evolution of a whole taxonomic group over long periods of time, and macro literally means over a large scale. And so in evolution, the macroevolutionary change is a change where one species becomes an entirely different species. Its nature is different, its appearance is different, how it manages life and thinks becomes different. And so it's moving from one species to another through the process of adaptation. This may appear to be very scientific, and it may appear to be very profound and very philosophically true. But we have to understand that when we discuss evolution, it led to a whole category and a wide variety of teachings that would introduce such things as racial science, eugenics, racial decorum, political racial decorum, and social evolution. It's very important that we consider the lack of credibility of such a system, because when we seek to understand it, the system consistently and will, for the bulk of the person's life, bring some individuals into a category by which they cannot escape. And the category that they are introduced to is a category that limits them for life. Because in evolution, the evolutionary theory says that there were some creatures that evolved that were stronger, and their brains evolved much better and to a greater degree. And when I say creatures, I'm not talking about the fish or the worms or things of that nature, but we're talking about humanoid beings now. The evolutionary theory suggests that in the evolutionary period, not all humanoids developed at the same rate or to the same degree. And so when we speak of the evolutionary theory, it suggests that there were some racial groups that evolved in a much higher rate, to a much higher degree, and therefore their brain capacity was greater. Their capacity to learn, their capacity for technology was greater. And so, in a sense, the evolutionary theory brought to some a position of superiority over other races. And to some, it brought by right of claims to the less involved racial groups, that they would never be equal, or they could never become totally human because of lack of evolutionary progress. And so what this theory did was to limit racial groups to a certain strata of society. And the strata of society would include the imposition of laws, philosophical content, and belief systems that will cause and would justify in the eyes of many for the domination and the control of those who were deemed to be less superior or even less human. Evolution brought forth a consideration that I call the evolutionary decorum. The evolutionary decorum was the system in which those who deemed themselves to be much more advanced and superior, it gave them the divine right of ascendancy to ascend above and beyond those races that were deemed to be less superior and to control them. And in a sense, those who came up with this evolutionary decorum felt that certain races were not fully human. And so the racial pecking order began. A part of the racial pecking order started from, of course, the higher leveled individuals who were considered to be the Caucasoids. The Caucasoids adapted the name of Caucasoid because the individual who gave the pecking order or the label to the specific groups considered that the Caucasus Mountains were the region that had the most beautiful women in the world. And so the fairer skinned races were considered to be Caucasoid because in the opinion of the individual who was developing the labels for the taxonomies, that the Caucasoid were the more beautiful of the species of mankind. Next were the Asiatic. Originally, they were called Mongoloid. And the Asiatic, of course, were those who were of Asian descent. And then thirdly, there was the Negroid. And the Negroid was considered to be less than human. And therefore, in the minds of those who developed this system, the Negroid did not have the capacity to learn. The Negroid did not have the capacity to understand academics, did not have the capacity to endure or to take care of themselves. And so the entire system of what we call evolution presented an issue by which some races would feel justified in controlling not just people, but the wealth of the land, the entire lands. And in this system, the system of divine right was also established. There was divine right, R-I-G-H-T, and divine right, R-I-T-E. Divine right, R-I-T-E, represented the divine ritual that mankind had to go through in order to preserve the world and preserve all of the resources of the world. And so it became a subject or a topic called the white man's burden. In this teaching, the white man felt because he was the Caucasoid and the highest level of evolved creatures, that it was his God-given duty to enforce colonization and rule over those nations and people who were considered to be less intelligent, less evolved, and less capable of taking care of themselves. And so the evolutionary system began to introduce those things that would set a vast system into effect that would spell tragedy, death, torture, and cruel, unjust treatment to many millions of individuals, not only the Africans, but also the American Indians, those who lived in the Aboriginal countries, those who lived in Tasmania. All of these races were considered to be the indigenous races, and these races were considered to be races of inferior quality, inferior understanding, inferior mental prowess, and therefore those who enforced evolution considered that they had the divine right, they had the logical right, and because they were considered to be superior, they had rights as being a superior being, much like we treat animals. And so the evolutionary process began to introduce several major types of evolutionary processes. It gave way to political evolutionary decorum, wherein politics then would be based upon giving and meeting the demands of the more evolved. The consensus of this was it's not necessary to try to spend money in neighborhoods where the less evolved can only do so much. And so the decorum system of politics began to flood dollars into arenas of those who were deemed to be higher evolved. Therefore, the Caucasians began to develop a complex of superiority, and they began to, of course, channel huge amounts of money, huge amounts of resources in their own neighborhoods, and giving meager resources to those who were deemed to be less superior. And that's why the educational systems were crippled, and the educational systems were not equal. The educational systems and requirements were not up to par in the arenas where individuals were considered to be less evolved. Not only did evolution bring about evolutionary decorum and political decorum, it brought about also racial evolution. Racial evolution, again, simply states that specific races did not evolve at the same rate, and therefore their mind capacity, the capacity to learn, to understand, and these unevolved, unintelligent species who were subhumans, they were considered to be capable of only breeding, working, violence, and, of course, bearing children and propagating their species. And so there was not much credence given to the black races or those races who are considered to be indigenous. And then with racial evolution, there comes social evolution. Social evolution then stated that society must protect itself from those who are brutal savages. Therefore, the laws and the structure of society has to be written from the position that it will benefit those who are the more superior, the more intelligent, the more productive citizens. And so many laws were placed into effect, and we know them as the Jim Crow laws and many other laws that inhibited the advancement of individuals who were considered to be less informed, less evolved. And it created, in a sense, a social caste system that would lock people into a society and a subculture that they would never be able to escape. And this modality of thinking caused a superior attitude by others. And in many cases, this superior attitude is the mindset, and it is the modus operandi by which those who deem themselves to be far superior live by. And even though times have changed, many in society still feel that blacks and those who are of the indigenous parts of society are subservient to them, less superior, and less capable of speaking, talking, learning, or being productive. And it appears that even in the advancement of educational processes, this mindset is still enforced today, that racial groups are separated by their evolutionary qualities, and that most of the darker-skinned individuals are not up to par with the rest of humanity. And in fact, they were considered at one time to be only 2/3 human, a subspecies. And this is the danger that propagated many of the prejudicial systems that still exist today, many of the systems that defined and took away the rights of human beings, even though historically these human beings were found to be quite intelligent. In Africa, there were certain countries given over for the exclusivity for mathematics. There were certain cities that were library cities that held the wisdom of their ancients, mathematicians and science, and even some biological things, astronomical things. And so we found that this evolutionary system was a construct not of truth, but a construct to produce a society that would enable those who pushed this system to thrive at the expense of others. I thank you for joining us, and we're going to continue on at a later date. And again, I am your host, Dr. Derek A. Reeves, and you have just been viewing Introduction to Social Evolution. Join us next time as we go further into the concepts of evolution, evolutionary decorum, social evolution, and even evolutionary political decorum. I thank you for watching. God bless.